For Western Europeans, the end of the 15th century was full of geographical news. Less than a decade earlier, Christopher Columbus had reached the Caribbean and Central America. In 1497, John Cabot sailed to Newfoundland, and soon after, in 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral set foot on the Brazilian coast. But it was Vasco da Gama who fulfilled the dream of many European adventurists, trekking all the way to Indian subcontinent by sea. The Mediterraneans have known the route to India since at least ancient times. However, unlike the Portuguese, their predecessors reached India via the Levant, the Middle East and the Arabian Sea, while the Portuguese made the entire journey by sea. The process of establishing Portuguese rule in the Indian Ocean was quite rapid, but more complicated and contradictory than it might seem. The arrival of Western Europeans by sea was a complete surprise in South Asia. It is worth noting how some Tunisian merchants were uncomfortably confused when they saw the first Portuguese sailor in Calicut. According to historical reports, they exclaimed indignantly, "May the devil take thee! What brought you hither?" When the Portuguese Armada bombarded Calicut in 1500, the local rulers were left in no doubt about the threat posed by the newcomers. The technological advantages of the Portuguese were determined by a number of reasons. The basis of their military power was sailing ships armed with a large number of cannons. It is a mistake to think that the locals were less skilled sailors. Apparently it was Indian Ocean rim seamen who invented the triangular sail, later adapted in the Mediterranean, which allowed sailing at an acute angle to the headwind. The local ships were built using a unique technique. Instead of nailing the planks together, they were sewn together. These ships were better able to withstand the impact of sea waves. However, the price of this flexibility was the inability to carry heavy artillery. Safavid Iran, one of the great gunpowder empires of the modern era, was the closest of all those capable of assisting the West Indian states in their fight against foreigners. But the Ottoman Empire, already a major force in Mediterranean politics at the time of the Portuguese discoveries, was to become an even more important ally. The Egyptian Mamluks, however, became perhaps the most important natural ally of the West Indian kingdoms. For several centuries after the early Crusades, the Mamluk Sultanate was one of the largest and richest powers in the Eastern Hemisphere. In addition to its large population and fertile land, Egypt had another very important source of wealth: an advantageous position on the trade routes connecting East and West. The economic prosperity of the Sultanate was ensured by its size and the skillful trading of the Karami merchants. Military power was guaranteed by the Mamluks, slave warriors who for many centuries successfully fought against external enemies, including such formidable opponents as the Mongols. The Egyptian Sultan, busy fighting the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire, apparently did not immediately recognize the threat posed by the Portuguese ships appearing in the Indian Ocean. However, attacks on trading caravans, which became more frequent shortly after da Gama's first voyage, and a significant drop in prices in Europe due to alternative spice imports, made the problem clear to the Egyptian ruler. At the first news of the Portuguese appearance in India, the Egyptian Sultan sent word throughout the West that he would destroy the Christian holy places in his land, including Jerusalem, if the Portuguese voyages and piracy were not stopped. The Pope was understandably concerned, but the Portuguese assured him that the Sultan wouldn't do that, because the pilgrimage was important for his economy. What is more, the threat did not deter the Portuguese. On the contrary, it greatly accelerated their advance in South Asia. The most important trading partner of Mamluk Egypt in the Mediterranean was the Venetian Republic. The famous splendid palaces, magnificent cathedrals and beautiful squares of Venice, as well as the masterpieces created for the doges and kept in the city's museums, were largely financed and secured by trade with the Mamluk Sultanate. And the lion's share of this trade was in spices. The Venetians had much to lose. It is not entirely clear whether the Mamluks officially asked them at a high diplomatic level for direct military support against the Portuguese. Different facts allow for different interpretations of the events that took place at the beginning of the 16th century. Eventually, after difficult and lengthy negotiations with the Mamluks, the Venetians sent timber, cannons and shipwrights to build a fleet on the Red Sea coast. By early 1507 preparations were complete, and the ships left the port of Suez for the shores of India. However, due to the turmoil and riots in the neighboring province, the navy had to remain in the Red Sea for a long time to pacify the enemies of the Mamluk Sultan. The total crew of the Mamluk ships was around 1,500 men. The squadron was led by the governor of Jeddah, Hussein al-Kurdi. Among the members of the expedition was the special envoy of the Zamorin of Calicut, Mehmed Markar. Eventually, after almost a year, the fleet entered the Indian Ocean and arrived at the destination port of Diu in early 1508. There the squadron joined the Gujarati galleys under the command of former Mamluk officer Malika Yars. The Allied fleet's plans included a connection with the naval forces of the Zamorin of Calicut. But due to communication problems this did not happen, and the Zamorin's fleet left the gathering point several months early. Finally, in the early spring of 1508, the combined flotilla moved towards Chaul, not far from present-day Mumbai. In March, at the mouth of the Chaul, the combined Egyptian-Indian fleet collided with a group of Portuguese ships. The meeting apparently came as a surprise to both sides. The Portuguese had 8 ships in total. This was not their entire naval force in the region. The squadron that clashed with the Mamluk Gujarati fleet was led by Lourenço de Almeida, son of Francisco de Almeida, the Viceroy of India. The Portuguese were probably busy with their usual routine, chasing down merchants who did not have permission to trade, and protecting licensed ships from pirates. The advisors, seeing significant Indian Mamluk forces, suggested that Lourenço withdraw. For reasons that are unclear today, the commander refused and decided to take the fight. The battle lasted over 2 days. As far as we know, the Portuguese fired their cannons quite effectively at their opponents. Mamluk and Gujarati warriors made several desperate, but unsuccessful attempts to board the Portuguese ships. The peculiarities of the design, the rounded and high sides of the caravels, which were unusual for Indian Ocean shipping, made such attacks very difficult. Eventually, the galleys of Malika Yars arrived, and this apparently determined the outcome of the battle. Lacking ammunition, and aware of the enemy's superiority, the Portuguese tried to leave Chaul Bay. However, the narrowness of the passage, and the low tide made this maneuver almost impossible. According to the information we have, Lourenço de Almeida, seriously wounded in the leg by a cannonball, ordered to tie himself to the mast. Thus he led the battle, encouraging his comrades, until the next cannon shot killed him. Ultimately, the Portuguese were defeated. Only 2 of the 8 ships managed to return to their own and inform the viceroy of the tragic news. It seems that the Portuguese did not try to surrender after the battle. Most likely, the victors would not have taken him prisoner, as the cruelty of Portuguese sailors in the Indian Ocean was already well known. Death in battle might have seemed a better fate than surrender. Traditionally, the success of the Indo-Mamluk fleet is often seen as an episodic event, as the victory did not prevent European expansion. Indeed, the very next year, Viceroy Francisco de Almeida inflicted a crushing defeat on the Indo-Egyptian fleet. Subsequently, the Portuguese greatly expanded their sphere of influence, capturing ports of great importance for Mesopotamian and Mediterranean trade. But even a simple compilation of the known facts reveals a remarkable degree of organization and composition of the participants in the anti-Portuguese coalition. The idea that the Hindu and Muslim kingdoms of India were supported by the Egyptian fleet, largely built at the expense of the Venetians, breaks the stereotypes of mutual antagonism between people of different cultures and religions in the past. Not all the efforts of the anti-Portuguese coalition were in vain. Although internal contradictions and external factors prevented the recent victors from developing their success, this consolidation had consequences. The Ottoman Empire was able to launch a series of successful campaigns deep into southern and central Europe over the next few decades. The Venetians were able to revive their spirit. The Portuguese monarchs had driven the Venetians out of Western European markets not by selling below market prices, but by trying to cut off Mamluk and Venetian supplies. Portuguese did this for several decades, but eventually, by the 1560s, the flow of spices through the Red Sea was equal to that of the 1490s. One of the reasons for this was the failure of repeated attempts by the Portuguese to take control of the Red Sea trade by capturing the port of Aden. As a result, Egypt was able to maintain partial control of the spice market. Nevertheless, the global trade in spices, and not just spices, had changed forever, and there were no chance to return to status quo.